Overlord Volume 8 Side 1, 1/2, Henry's Tumultuous and Hectic Days retranslated by Nigel edited/proofed by Deus Ex Machina Part 1. Henry Amat rose before the sun came up to make breakfast. She was not as good a cook as her deceased mother, and there was a lot of food to prepare. Counting Nemu, Henry herself, and the 19 goblins loyal to her, she had to make breakfast for 21 people. Cooking for 2 more on top of those would make 23 in total. Preparing that much food was a lot of work, and could be considered a battle in its own right. Henry trembled while looking at the vast quantity of food in front of her, and realized that it would all be gone in one meal. This is nearly 6 times as much as before. After taking a deep breath, she rolled up her sleeves, psyched herself up and got to work. She silently sliced up the vegetables, and then the meat. The process was engraved into Henry's mind by now. Although Henry was not especially talented at cooking, the fact that she had learned to cope with such an enormous task in such a short time was a textbook example of how diamonds were made under pressure. Her little sister woke from the sound of Henry making breakfast, and rubbed the sleep out of her eyes. "Morning, Wani-chan. Let me help too." "Morning, Nemu. I'm good over here, but there's still that thing I asked you to help me take care of yesterday." Unhappiness flashed over Nemu's face for a moment, but in the end, she did not complain, although she did droop her head and reply, "K," as she obeyed Henry. Henry's hands stopped. Her heart ached. Nemu was 10 years old now, and she had been a lively and spirited girl once. After that incident, the formerly naive and carefree Nemu was now slavishly obedient to her sister, without any of the playfulness or tantrums of children her age. She was a good girl now, so good that it hurt. The smiling faces of her parents appeared in Henry's mind. Although several months had passed, the wounds from that incident had not yet healed. If they had died because of illness, she could have prepared herself for it. If they had died from an accident or a natural disaster, she would not have hated anyone else for it, and maybe she would not have been scarred either. But her parents had been murdered in front of her eyes, and her heart was now filled with resentment. There was no way she could feel otherwise. Henry squeezed her eyes shut. If there was someone nearby, then she could work hard so they would not see her weakness. But when she was by herself, the loneliness reopened the wounds in her heart. Isn't that right? She still saw her parents' kind smiles floating in the darkness behind her eyes. Even when she opened them, their forms did not fade from her vision. She replayed the tender moments of the past in her mind, over and over again. After that came the maelstrom of black emotions in her heart, her hatred for the people who had murdered her parents. Driven by them, Henry slammed her cleaver into the meat with all her might, splitting it in half. However, since she used too much force, she also chopped a divot out of the block, which made her furrow her brow in frustration. If the blade gets chipped, it's going to be hard to fix. "I'm sorry, Oka-san." Henry covered up the hole as she apologized for damaging the cleaver that was her only link to her deceased mother. She gently ran a finger along the edge to make sure it was fine, and at that moment, the door beside her, which led to the living room, opened up. The person who entered was not human, but someone shorter, one of the demi-humans commonly known as goblins. "Morning, Ain-san. Today's my turn to, what's wrong?" The goblin paused in the middle of a perfect bow to turn concerned eyes to Henry's hands. Henry was a mere village girl, but the goblins served her without hesitation because she was their summoner. After that incident, when the villagers had wondered if they needed to take shifts standing guard, Henry remembered the horn she had been given and used it to summon the goblins. The villagers were initially surprised and afraid of the goblins, since they had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but they calmed down when Henry told them that she had summoned the goblins with an item from their savior, Ain's old gown. Needless to say, this was because of the gratitude and trust they felt towards Ain's. Thereafter, the work the goblins had done was enough for the villagers to put aside their suspicions and welcome them from the depths of their hearts. "Good morning, Kaijali-san. I just used a bit too much force with the cleaver." Kaijali was one of Henry's summoned goblins. He furrowed his brows, looking like a man-eating bear awakened from his winter hibernation, and put a concerned expression on his face before looking at Henry. That's no good, you need to take care of that cleaver. The village doesn't have a blacksmith, so we can't repair our equipment either. Is that so? Well, it's all right. We'll think of a solution when the time comes. Kaijali spoke in an earnest, yet cheerful voice while he helped make the breakfast. He drew a smoldering wick from the pot he was holding, and with a practiced maneuver, lit the stove. The deft ease with which he turned a faint ember into a roaring blaze was evidence of his skill. But they can't cook. Why is that? Goblins could not prepare even the simplest meals. Since they ate raw meat and vegetables without a complaint, she thought they might like raw food more, but it became clear that they preferred cooked meals, although they could still stomach raw food without trouble. Is it because summoned beings don't know how to cook? A mere village girl like herself had no answer to this question, and with that she threw herself into her work once more. Fortunately, the cleaver's edge was still intact. Eventually, breakfast was ready. There were a wider variety of dishes on the table compared to the days when her mother was cooking. For example, there was meat. Although the local rangers often shared their kills in the past, the amount they could bring back was nothing compared to now. The reason why they had so much more meat now was because the villagers had expanded their area of activity. The great forest of Taub provided its bounty to them in the form of firewood, food in the form of fruits and wild vegetables, animals for meat and fur, and even medicinal herbs. Although the forest was rightfully regarded as a treasure trove, it was also home to wild beasts and monsters, which could make their way back to the village. As a result, the forest was not a place where the villagers could casually enter. Even the experts, like professional hunters, were forced to skulk like thieves seeking treasure on the edges of the wise king of the forest's territory. However, with the disappearance of the wise king of the forest and appearance of the goblins, the situation had changed radically. The greatest change was that the villagers could now easily enter the forest and harvest its resources. The work of the goblins, who were strong beings, were a key factor in this. Meat, which had previously been hard to obtain, could now be easily acquired, and their tables were decked with fresh fruits and vegetables. As a result, the food situation in the village had dramatically improved. In addition, since the goblins were Enri's subordinates, they delivered the lion's share of their kills to her home. In addition, one of the newest additions to the village was a ranger who had made contributions to the provisions. She was a woman who used to be an adventurer in Irantal. For various reasons, she moved to this village, and was learning the ways of the hunter from the ranger who was living in the village. As she had been a warrior during her adventuring days, her skills with the bow were excellent, and she could bring down even the biggest game with a few arrows. It was partly because of her efforts that the distribution of meat in the village had improved. The improved standard of living brought changes, which were reflected in the villagers' bodies. Enri curled her biceps, flexing her muscles. Her gains were quite impressive. I feel so pumped they're getting even bigger. The goblins praised Enri at every opportunity with phrases like Ainsan's totally ripped. Yeah, pump it up again. She's too swole to control. Aim for a six-pack. Look at how cut she is. They most likely meant well, but as a girl, it was difficult to accept such compliments. If I ended up like how the goblins described, it wouldn't be good. Enri swept the goblin's idealized final form of herself from her mind, and began serving breakfast. That too was a tedious task. While the goblins would not quibble over a small difference in portion size, the amount of meat in their soup was a huge issue. Enri ensured that everyone's dishes and bowls had a similar amount of meat, before moving on to the next task. Eventually, breakfast was ready, and sweat dripped from her forehead. Then, let's call everyone, the goblins, and Firia over. Yes, I'll go. Let me do it. I want to do it. As Enri turned around, she saw Nemu standing behind her with eyes alight. Have you done your chores? Her sister nodded by way of reply, and so did Enri. Really? Then go get NFI-no. I want to call the goblins. Enri had no idea how to answer her little sister's sudden outburst. Kaijali nodded gently to Nemu, presumably indicating that he would entrust her with that task. I'll leave that to you then. I'll go get Firia. That's more like it. A capital idea. Ain-san, let me go with you. Although this would leave the house empty, it did not bother Henry. After all, there had never been any issues with thieves breaking in before. Together with Kaijali, Henry left the house just after Nimue did. The wind blew on Henry's face, carrying the scent of grass, and warmed by the gentle light of the morning sun. Henry took a deep breath, and when she turned to look at Kaijali, he was breathing in the scent as well. Henry could not help smiling at the sight, and Kaijali scowled, trying to regain his lost dignity with a fierce expression. Perhaps the Henry of the past would have been afraid, but Henry was used to living with the goblins now, and she knew this was just how he smiled. On this refreshing, cool and clear day, Henry proceeded to the house next to hers. It had been left ownerless from the tragedy that had befallen their village recently and had become the home of the alchemists from Irantal, the Barriers. The house was occupied by two people. One of them was an old woman, the grizzled, experienced herbalist Lizzie Berar. The other was her grandson and Henry's friend, Nfiria Berar. The two of them spent their days cooped up in the house, processing herbs to make potions and other medicines. Not working closely with other villagers was a good reason to be isolated, and in the worst-case scenario, to be kicked out of the village. But it was different for those two. In every village, an apothecary, someone who could prepare medicines in case of disease or injury, was indispensable. They could be said to be important enough that the villagers would plead, "You don't need to do anything except make medicine for us." This went double for a place like Carne village, which had no access to priests who could use healing magic. Incidentally, priests would double as the village apothecary in larger villages. Priests would charge an appropriate fee for their healing magic. Or rather, it might be better to say that they would need to charge the fee. If the villagers could not afford to pay, then they would offer up their labor instead. For those who lacked the ability to even do that, the priests would use medicines compounded from herbs, since herbal cures were less expensive than magical healing. One of the goblins in the village was a cleric, and he could heal minor wounds with ease, but the villagers had come together with the opinion that he should save up his power for an emergency, unless someone was very badly hurt. Not to mention, the cleric's healing spells were very limited, and lacked the ability to heal diseases or neutralize poisons. Therefore, everyone was grateful to the Barriers for the work they did. Even so, the villagers did not dare approach them despite the vital job they performed. The reason for this was abundantly clear as one approached the Barriers' residence. Henry scrunched up her nose, as did Kaijali, although the expression looked more evil on his face. An acrid stench wreathed the house which they were approaching. The odor was not actually that awful, though it still made them feel ill. The smell released from crushing up herbs might be off-putting, but ultimately it was only the scent of plants, and was not dangerous in itself. Breathing through her mouth, Henry knocked on the door. She knocked quite a few times, but nobody answered the door. Just when she thought nobody was home, the sound of someone approaching came from the other side. She heard someone hastily fumbling with the lock on the other side, and then the door opened. She did not want to react with her expression or words, but the smell coming from inside the house was truly unbearable. It was painful. A harsh, stinging pain seared her eyes, nose and mouth. Worse still, the vile stench from inside the house suggested that the miasma around the house was nothing more than what had leaked out from inside. "Good morning, Henry." Nfiria's eyes, which were visible from between the gaps in his long hair, were wide open and bloodshot. He must have stayed up all night for alchemical experiments again. She did not want to open her mouth to speak, when she was enveloped by the eye-watering odor, but it would be rude not to return a greeting. "Gee, good morning, Enfi." She felt her throat dry out as she said that. "Morning, Ani-san." "Ah, good morning, Kaijali-san." "Ha, it's morning already? I was working so hard I didn't notice. Seeing the sun makes me realize how the time just flew by. I've been doing so many experiments recently, I need to get out of the house." Nfiria stretched like a cat and yawned. "Looks like you've been burning the midnight oil." Henry was about to add "breakfast's ready, come over with Obasama," but Nfiria interrupted. Or rather, instead of saying he interrupted her, it might be better to say that she was overwhelmed by his boyish enthusiasm. "It's amazing, Henry." Nympharia rushed up to her. His work clothes reeked of that same stinging odor which filled the rest of the house. Although Henry wanted very much to back away from him, she forced herself to endure it, because Nympharia was her dear friend. What happened, Enfi? You've got to hear this. We finally managed to perfect the procedure for brewing a new type of potion. This is going to change the world. Even though all we did was to mix the herbs that we gathered into the solution, we managed to produce a purple potion. The only reply he received was a huh. Henry had no idea how this was amazing. Was the potion purple because they infused purple cabbage into it? And it can cure wounds. The healing speed's on par with alchemically refined potions. Henry raised his hands, showing off his delicate, slender arms that were unmarred by injury. Henry thought, I have bigger biceps than he does, but Nympharia didn't stop there. Which is to say, yes, that's wonderful, tell us about it later. Kaijali spoke as he took a step forward. Anisan here looks like he's been sleeping too little and partying too hard. Maybe he's high or something. Ain-san, let me take care of this. Why don't you go back first? Will it be all right? Sure it will. I'll splash some cold water on his face, and when he calms down, I'll bring him over. If you take too long, others will get worried. Say, what about Baa-san? Obachan still got her head buried in her research. I don't think she'll be coming for breakfast. I'm sorry, you went through all this trouble to prepare breakfast for us. Don't worry about it. I was thinking that Lizzie-sama would probably be doing that. Situations like these had come up quite a few times already, so it was hardly a surprise. Then, Ain-san, you should head back first. With that said, there was nothing to do but leave. Then, I'll leave him to you. As he watched Henry leave, Kaijali turned a cold stare on Nympharia. The hell were you doing back there? The only time a girl listens to a man talking about what he likes is if she likes the person. If she doesn't like that person, then that blabbering's only going to turn her off. I'm sorry, I just thought that since we made that amazing discovery, but it was really amazing. Revolutionary, even. Kaijali interrupted the motor-mouthed rant with a chopping motion. Clearly, Nympharia had not gotten the message he was trying to convey. Look, Ani-san. Are you all right with this? You're in love with Ain-san, aren't you? Nympharia replied with an and nodded his head vigorously. Then you have to make her the most important person in your heart. More important than your potions. I get it. I'll try. Do, or do not. There is no try. You need to win her heart. Me and the rest of the lads will do our best to back you up. Plus, it's not just us, even Amuro-san agreed to help you out. I hope you get yourself together and do your part, Ani-san. If you're just waiting for her to say I like you first, then more likely than not, someone else is going to snatch her away, you know? You've got to work up the courage to tell her how you really feel. That line pierced Nympharia's heart like a dagger between the ribs. Still, despite everything I said, looks like you've been doing pretty well on that front yourself, Ani-san. Used to be you couldn't even say a word in front of her. Now you can carry on a normal conversation, right? That was because I didn't have much chance to talk with Henry unless I came around to gather herbs. Now that I've moved into the village, I'm around her a lot more. That's it, that's the spirit. All that's left is to gather your courage and step up to the plate. Maybe you should show off your strength first. According to the villagers, strong men are still the most attractive. Well, for the 49-year-old women in the village anyways. I'm not too confident in my arm strength. Maybe I should do more farm work, or something. Nah, what you should be using is this, Enfinizan, Kaijali spoke while gently tapping his head. Settle things with this. And then work your magic. If me or one of the lads think you've got a chance to score points with her, we'll pose like this. That's your cue to say something or act in a way to make her fall in love with you. Kaijali flexed his arms in a front double bicep curl. They bulged mightily under his skin. Kinda like that. And if you need a more impressive demonstration. Next, Kaijali flexed his pectorals with a side chest spread. Although he was quite short, his athletic, muscular body attested to the fact that he was a born warrior. Nympharia wondered why these poses? However, he could sense Kaijali's goodwill, so he did not actually ask that question. Still, there was one question he wanted to ask. I'm curious, why are you guys doing this? I mean, I know you're Enri's subordinates and you're loyal to her, but I don't understand why you're helping me. Well, that's simple, Kaijali replied with an inscrutable expression on his face. In a tone better suited to coaxing little kids to behave, he replied, that's because we all want Ain-san to be happy. And from where we're looking, you fit the bill. So the faster you two get married, the better. And no need for such a rush. The two of us can slowly reduce the distance between us, right? That would be too slow. I mean, don't humans take a long time between getting pregnant and having kids? Nympharia's eyes went wide and his face turned pink as the conversation suddenly jumped to pregnancy, the final form of male-female relationships. That would be about 9 months? Then it would take a really long time for about 10 pups, 10 kids, right? 10? Isn't that a bit much? 5 children were the average for a farming village family. In tough times when it was hard to survive to adulthood, this number would go up. In the city, this number was usually less, with the help of priests to cure diseases, or the use of contraceptives. So, a woman giving birth to 10 children was not a bit much, it was way too much. What are you on about? It's pretty normal for us goblins. We're not goblins. Alright, point taken, our races have our differences, but still, you gotta have lots of kids to make Ain-san happy. Alright, I can't deny that she might be happy with a house full of children, but it still seems kind of wrong. Really? Nympharia was at a loss for words as he saw Kaijali looking at him with his head tilted at an angle. But on the whole, he was still grateful for their assistance. Then, let's head out, Ani-san. I hope you make a move soon. Although keeping her waiting for too long might cause problems, well, I think a steady, tactical advance on the main objective is a strategy worth pursuing. Where did you learn all of this? Nympharia shook his head. Oi, Oba-chan, I'm going to Enri's for breakfast, what about you? The reply that came from the house was a refusal to Nympharia's question. Most likely, she was in the middle of repeating an experiment, and had no time to bother with trivial things such as eating. Nympharia could relate to that feeling. The alchemical tools and other paraphernalia in the house were of an extremely high grade, and they did not know how to use most of them. The maid in the service of the great magic caster Ain's Ulgaun had brought them over. The two of them had been ordered to use these materials to produce new potions and alchemical items. Oh, and the maid had even brought some sort of legendary herb said to cure all illnesses. When he asked her about the solvents and the proper usage of the instruments, all he got in return was a figure-it-out-yourself sue, which did not help things. So, the two of them had foregone food and sleep in their ceaseless quest to learn how to use these devices for experiments. It was a slow process, but they had finally made some progress. Of course, they had made mistakes as well. The past 2 months had been very busy for Lizzie, of course, but Nympharia was no exception either. The fruits of their labor stood on the table, that bottle of purple potion, which Lizzie examined endlessly and filled Nympharia with excited joy. I'll bring back some food, then, Nympharia spoke as he closed the door behind him. Then, he turned to Kaijali, let's go. Diamond suit, diamond suit, diamond suit. Although everyone was supposed to eat together, Enri's house was nowhere near big enough to accommodate them all. As such, they usually ate outside when the weather was good. Because they were outdoors, a certain amount of rowdiness was expected and tolerated. Had they been inside, it might have been unbearable, but even under the present circumstances, the situation had quickly turned aggravating. That's why I'm saying, Enri Ain-san is going to be my wife. Hey, punk, are you forgetting the agreement we all made not to touch Ain-san? That's right, if you try and pull a fast one on us then I'll make my move too. You what, mate? I was first. Several goblins kicked over their chairs as they suddenly stood up, and some even jumped onto the table. Henry swallowed her anger and spoke kindly to them. Everyone, please settle down. However, the anger in the goblins' eyes had not faded in the slightest. Just give it up, lads. The victor has already been decided. Behold, this hunk of marvelous, radiant meat. One of the goblins, Carne, raised up his spoon to prove his point, displaying a piece of meat that onlookers might well have mistaken for a pea. It was nothing more than a tiny bit extra that Henry had missed while portioning out the food to everyone. I finished my meat, yet there was more at the bottom of the soup. Do you have anything like that? I didn't think so. This is nothing less than the proof of love. You must be kidding me. That's nothing more than a piece of meat Ainsan mistook for a chunk of vegetable. Maybe that's just wishful thinking on your part? Maybe the meat you ate was just potatoes or something, and the actual meat you got was that miniature thing. You'd better watch out, it's proof that Ainsan doesn't like you. Plus, my god clearly told me, you must make Henry happy. Isn't the god you believe in an evil one, Carne? Half the goblins were standing, and the other half were seated and squabbling, fanning the flames of conflict. Even Nemu had somehow joined the agitators. Only a few people were not participating in this battle royale. Those people had their heads lowered to the table, and the most prominent one of them was Nfiria. Powdered ruby, arcane feathers, ashwood pestle, more mortar, tar tatas? Nfiria was muttering to himself as he spooned the food into his mouth, but the food in the spoon did not even reach his mouth before it went back to the bowl. His eyes were hidden by his long hair, but in all likelihood he was walking on the thin line between dreams and reality. Enfi, are you all right? The goblins were still arguing, and although it probably was not safe to leave them alone for too long lest the conflict spiral out of control, Nfiria was really out of it, and she could not ignore him. He was most likely suffering from sleep deprivation, judging by the way he had begun wobbling the moment he sat down, as though he was about to fall over to his side at any moment. When he actually started on breakfast, he looked like one of the undead, completely bereft of life or intelligence. Ah, don't worry about me, Henry who? Hey Enfi, get it together. Besides, weren't you the one who said Nemu was my waifu and all that earlier? That was then, this is now. I only just realized it recently. I used to think since Nemu-san was 10, and was about the same height as us, that she was of a marriageable age. But humans they only consider them adults at 15. Eh? Is that true? Ainsan isn't a species like hobhuman? The goblins leapt from topic to topic with incomparable speed. Henry wanted to ask them what a hobhuman was, but before she could open her mouth, the goblins had already gotten tired of the discussion and started a whole new argument for everyone to participate in. Ah! You stole my bread. My wolf's still hungry, don't be such a tightwad. Everyone. Henry was shouting at this point, but her voice still could not carry over the racket the goblins were generating. Spoons and plates were flying, while shouts and angry roars rose and fell like waves in a storm-tossed bay. Of course, everything being thrown was empty, because none of the goblins would even dream of wasting the food Henry made for them. Still, it was utterly inexcusable. Steeling herself, Henry furrowed her brows and took a deep breath. Don't wolves eat meat? Just because you're higher level than me, don't go thinking I can't whup you fist to fist. Fist to fist, you say? Since you're so hungry, how about a knuckle sandwich? And just as Henry stood up, everyone immediately returned to their seats, and calmly resumed their meal as though nothing was wrong. That's enough, all of you. Quiet down. Henry's furious bellow echoed across the silent air above the breakfast table. Ah, surprised, Henry looked all around, but the only thing she could see were the goblins looking at her with expressions on their faces which said, "We were all quietly having breakfast, is that a problem, or being suddenly shouted at for no reason at is really vexing." After standing silently for a while, she plopped back into her seat, red-faced. Fa-ha-ha-ha-ha. The first to break the silence was Nemu. Then, unable to contain herself, Henry followed suit, clutching her stomach, as she laughed, and then the goblins joined in as well. That flawless coordination and timing could not have taken place without careful discussion and preparation. It was quite amazing how seriously they had prepared for a prank like this. Ah, that was just weird. Were you all planning to make fun of me from the start? Even though she was tearing up because she was laughing too hard, Henry made a show of being angry as she asked them. Of course, Ain-san. We wouldn't argue about things like this for real. That's right, Ain-san. Yup. The goblins bragged without the slightest hint of shame, deflecting Henry's questions with jovial expressions on their faces. In response, Henry targeted Kaijali, turning a fierce stare on him. Under her stern gaze, Kaijali wilted, averting his eyes as he responded in a small voice that abdicated all responsibility. You see, how do I say this, we thought you looked a little down, Ain-san. Several nearby goblins shrank away, their heads lowered as they looked around uncomfortably without saying a word. Everyone, that's because we're all your bodyguards, Ain-san. That's right. Yep. Bodyguards. We put a lot of thought into our bodyguard entrance pose too. That's right. Now, Ain-san and Nimue-san, stand here, in the middle, like this. Me too? Of course you do. Now, the two of you, raise both your arms like this, that's right, in a totally cool and awesome way. Yes, that's it. Even if she gave them the benefit of the doubt, this pose made them look like frogs stretching their arms out to the sky. Look, I understand your good intentions, and to begin with, you don't need to be my bodyguards, right, Enfi? Henry turned her head to her childhood friend sitting beside her for aid, but found that there was nobody there. She had a bad feeling about this, but still shifted her line of sight down just a little bit, and found that Infiria's head was resting face down in his bowl of soup. Enfi. Henry immediately scooped up the toppled Enfi, crying out as her face turned pale. Carne quickly rushed over, and peeled Infiria's eyes open with his fingers. He's just asleep. If you leave him like this until noon, he should be all right. Enfi, what am I going to do with you? Henry was thinking that she should return Firia to his own bed. So she hefted him onto her back, and began heading out, leaving behind such conversational gems as shouldn't their positions be reversed normally? Nimue-san, you can't say these things. Ani-san, you. After the wheat was harvested, the tax collectors would come around the village. Henry was obviously worried about how she was going to explain the presence of the goblins in the village. Should she say they were summoned beasts, or that they were her henchmen, or maybe she should say, Henry had the feeling that they were always concerned about her. They did not simply concern themselves with protecting her life, they thought about her feelings too. What could she do for these goblins? What could she do for these rowdy and reliable new members of her family? Diamond suit. Henry bundled up the weeds she had just finished cutting and used the still clean back of her hand to wipe away the sweat trickling down her neck. The large pile of shredded plant matter gave off the scent of freshly cut grass. Her body was tired from working long hours in the field, and the way her sweat-slicked clothes clung to her body made Henry uncomfortable. To lift her mood, Henry stretched herself out. As she did, her eyes swept across the sprawling fields. The wheat they had planted had grown slowly but steadily, and as the harvest season approached, the wheat would slowly turn golden. Although a wheat field painted gold was a beautiful sight, the weeding work before that was both essential and annoying. If it was not done, the gold color would be very sparsely distributed. Her labor now was entirely for the sake of the harvest to come. She straightened her body to loosen up her stiff muscles, and to let her tightly wound body relax. The wind felt refreshingly cool on her skin, that had been overheated from long hours of field work. The wind also brought the sound of a commotion from the village to her ears. It sounded like something banging on something, and shouts for getting people to combine their strength as one. These were sounds that had never been heard before in the village. At this moment, the village was working to turn all manner of plans and ideas into reality. Of these plans, the ones with the highest priority were the wall surrounding the village, and the construction of the watchtowers. It went without saying that all these projects were intended to turn the village into a fortress. Carne village stood at the edge of the great forest of Taub, and the forest was the home of many wild beasts. In other words, it was dangerous territory. It would be impossible to live in peace there without the protection of sturdy walls. However, Carne village was laid out in neat rows of houses radiating from a central square in all directions. Without anything like a wall in place, anyone could easily enter the village. Until recently, the village had been peaceful, and the monsters had not entered, even though it was right next to the forest. That was because the mighty creature known as the wise king of the forest had continually expanded its territory, and as such, no beast dared move around in the forest near the village. Thus, the village defenses were nigh impregnable. And then, all this had changed due to human intervention. The knights of the empire had attacked the village and killed her parents. As a result, nobody in the village held on to the hope that things would go back to the way they used to be. To that end, the leader of the goblin troop Jugemu had proposed the fortification of the village as a countermeasure against such a scenario. Once he mentioned that the goblins would be unable to protect the village if it was attacked again due to their lack of numbers, the motion immediately received unanimous approval from all parties concerned. This was because even now, many of the villagers still could not forget the nightmare that had taken place. The first step was to dismantle the unoccupied houses and use them to build a wall. Of course, those materials were insufficient on their own, so they would have to enter the forest to cut down trees for lumber. Since entering the forest's depths might mean trespassing in the wise king of the forest's territory, they had to travel a long way, along the outskirts of the forest. Naturally, the goblins were the ones who provided security for the woodcutting villagers. As a result of them taking on that task, the villagers' wariness of the goblins had almost completely disappeared. Part of that was because the knights who had attacked them were human, just like themselves. They had tried to kill the villagers despite being members of the same species. In contrast, the goblins might have been of a different species, but they worked hard for the village under Henry. The decision of which side to trust was no longer one which could be easily settled by deciding along racial lines. And the most important reason was that the goblins were stronger than anyone else. As warriors they could conduct patrols, and when people were hurt, the goblin cleric Carne could heal them. It was difficult to despise goblins like these. In this way, the goblins managed to establish themselves in the village in just a few short days, and quickly became an indispensable part of village life. This could be seen from the house the goblins lived in. No consideration had been made of the fact that they were from another race, and a large house had been built close to Henry's own home in the middle of the village. Although the villagers and the goblins had worked together on the village defense plan, there simply were not enough hands to make the work go quickly. As such, in the beginning they had only built simple fences. As fate would have it, the wise king of the forest, who had kept the monsters at bay from the village, became a follower of an amazingly skilled black-armored warrior and abandoned its territory. Although they had managed to complete the fences with great effort, the villagers could not take joy in their accomplishment, but instead sighed about their rotten luck. However, a sturdy wall now defended the village. All this was thanks to the stone golems which the beautiful maid who served the village's savior Ains Ulgaun had brought with her. Golems were inexhaustible constructs. When given an order they would silently execute it, and their strength far outstripped that of a human being. Although their lack of dexterity meant that they could not perform certain tasks which required precision, their participation in the work had enabled it to proceed with an unbelievable speed. With the effort of the